Dr. Corey DeAngelis, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I got to correct you really quickly. I'm not a real doctor. I'm more like a Jill Biden doctor.
That's right. You're a doctor of education. I couldn't help myself. I wanted to have you on the show for a long time. First of all, because you're a fellow paisano, as we were saying before we got started. So I have a bias towards that. But you are among, I think, the best places to go on the internet for what's happening when it comes to school choice and reform of our education system. And so I want to take this time to pick your brain on where we are. You got a new book, The Parent Revolution. And I want to believe that's true. I want to believe that's happening. It's a very optimistic book. So I guess let's start with that. First of all, I noticed I've got my little reference here. You are currently number one in Amazon in a very particular area. But number two right behind you is The Profiteers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. So how do you feel about beating out that book with yours?
Yeah, I think I've beat him by a long shot since then. It hit a USA Today national bestseller list. It's recently been endorsed by former President Donald Trump. And if you want to take Ted Cruz's advice, senator from my home state and your home state of Texas, he says on the back, you can ruin Randy Weingarten's day by reading this book. I actually dedicated it to Randy Weingarten herself. I sent her a copy as well. She's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, and I dedicated it to her for overplaying her hand, awakening a sleeping giant, parents, and inadvertently doing more to advance school choice and homeschooling than anyone could have ever imagined. Families got to see through remote learning, which, look, we really should have just called it remotely learning. There wasn't a lot of learning going on. What was happening in the classroom? The schools were focusing on indoctrination as opposed to education. So the unions, by pushing to keep the schools closed, they lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools. They were fear-mongering every step of the way. They had fake body bags, tombstones, fake coffins and caskets. It was ridiculous. They even, in one case, at the Chicago Teachers Union, they deleted a tweet that claimed, quote, "The push to reopen schools is rooted in, you guessed it, sexism, racism, and misogyny." They threw every buzzword at the wall to see what would stick. But that showed families, one, the school system didn't give a crap about the parents all that much. And then two, the schools that they thought were okay were not okay. There was too much focusing on the LGBTs as opposed to the ABCs. Families weren't happy. They're pissed off. They've become a new special interest group of sorts, one for the kids as opposed to the employees.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation. So I want to set the table with where we are right now in terms of our options for our kids. So the book lays out, in some ways, a lot of wins. There's been a lot of states that have opened up the ability to send your kids to the school of your choice and have your tax dollars in one way or another move with your choice rather than be stuck in your zip code. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. What is the current sort of state of K through 12 education for most Americans today?
Yeah, I mean, for most Americans, it isn't that great. So the book is optimistic for the advancements we've had. In the past 3 years, we've had more advancement on school choice than in the preceding 3 decades. So at the moment, we're winning so much, I'm almost getting tired of winning, but we're not there yet in all 50 states. We've had 12 states pass what I call universal school choice, Milton Friedman's vision finally coming to fruition right before our very eyes. But in the status quo in too many states, before these expansions happened, in most states actually, you live in one place, you're assigned to a school based on where you live, And if you want to go somewhere else, it's basically too bad. You got to pay out of pocket. You got to pay twice, once through the tax system and then again out of pocket. Or if you have the means to do so, you can move to a house that's assigned to a better quote unquote public school. Just imagine if anything else was structured this way. Imagine if you were assigned to a grocery store or a restaurant just based on where you lived, and they were giving you food poisoning, they were giving you expired groceries, or like in too many socialist countries, they didn't even have the goods on the shelves, and you had to move to go somewhere else. That would create tons of monopoly power for restaurants and grocery stores, and that's the problem with the K through 12 government-run school system today. We shouldn't even call them public schools. They're not accessible to the public. Families have actually gone to jail for lying about their address to get into better so-called public schools. It's not like a public park where anybody can access it. They are restrictive. They discriminate on the basis of zip code. They are not accessible to all. They're not accountable to the public. Look at what happened over the past few years when parents were not happy with the critical race theory or gender ideology in the classroom or whatever the problem may be. Parents were told for a long time that if they weren't happy, they could just show up at the school board meeting and they'd listen to them. That didn't actually happen because they only wanted to listen to parents who agreed with their ideology. So when parents pushed back, they had their mics cut off at the school board meeting. They were labeled as evil people. And in one case, there was a letter sent by the National School Boards Association sent to Biden implying that parents under the Patriot Act of all things should be labeled as domestic terrorists. There was even an earlier draft of this letter that was sent out that called for the military and the National Guard to be deployed to school board meetings to bully and silence parents into submission. Why? Because they viewed parents not as partners, not as customers, but as the enemy, as a nuisance. And so with school choice, with the money following the child, that gives parents more authority and power and leverage in that conversation so that the school board actually has an incentive to listen to them as opposed to trying to shut them up. But as I document in the parent revolution, the hope comes along because parents can band together and become a new interest group that's more powerful than the teachers' unions. And they were successful in basically making the NSBA implode. 26 states have already left the National School Boards Association. We should call them the Regional School Boards Association at this point, but that just goes to show you when parents lock arms and fight back, they have more power in numbers than the teachers' unions. And guess what? They care about their kids more than anybody else. So they become a new political juggernaut, a political force to be reckoned with. And politicians are finally being forced to listen to them.
You know, one of the things that is sort of, I think, often forgotten or not really fully realized about the way our public school system is structured, the fact that it's zip code based, the fact that it's based on where you can afford to own or rent, is it seems like it fundamentally politicizes something that doesn't actually need to be politicized. Like everything you're laying out, these battles in these school board meetings, all of that sounds horrible. Like I, as a parent, don't want to have to go to war to have my kid be able to get a good education, to have his curiosity sparked, to advance and master important subjects that are going to help him pursue his dreams. Like none of that inherently feels like it should be a political act. So break it down for me. Why is this so damn political?
Well, the Democrat Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers' unions. When you ask voters, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, it's not a political issue. Families support school choice in large numbers, whether you're looking at any type of racial background or political background or any other type of demographic. Families want school choice. And when school choice passes, guess what? Families from all backgrounds benefit and use school choice options. And so the problem is, you think about Randy Weingarten, who I dedicated my book to. She's the head of the AFT. 99.97% of the contributions from her union went to Democrats in 2022. You can look on the Open Secrets website. It's been like this for decades. It's a money laundering operation that just funnels from the government school system through the unions to Democrat campaign coffers, and that's the only problem. The problem is politicians, unfortunately, listen more to politics and power than morality or the needs of families. And so they listen to the campaign contributions, the special interests who control them, and not necessarily the voters on the ground. But that dynamic is changing. And the good news that I lay out in the Parent Revolution is that because families have woken up and they're putting a spotlight, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant, on the status quo government school system, and they're taking that energy to the ballot box, parents are holding politicians accountable and making them listen to the families and their children as opposed to the adults in the public school system. And we've seen some Democrats defect on the issue right after 2021. If you might not remember, but in Virginia, the gubernatorial election went to a Republican on the issue of education, Terry McAuliffe. He said right before the election that, quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach." And in a state that went 10 points to Biden just the year before, Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, won with education voters by 6 points. A Republican doing this. This usually does not happen. And that was the number 2 issue in that election. And so other Democrats might be looking at the Terry McAuliffe story saying, I don't want that to happen to me. Think about in Pennsylvania with Josh Shapiro, a Democrat who was up by double digits in the polls. His opponent, Doug Mastriano, the Republican, started calling him out on school choice. He said, look, why don't you support school choice? I do. You went to private school yourself. You're a hypocrite. Conveniently for Shapiro, right after that, he quietly changed his education platform to include private school choice in the form of Lifeline scholarships, a bill that in fact was run by a Republican through their House that year. Now, I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal, and some conservatives actually pushed back on me and said, why are you campaigning for Shapiro? And my response was, that's not the point of the op-ed. The article was to point out that, look, this is a big deal. I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. If you're going to support school choice, I'm going to shine a spotlight on it to hold you accountable and make sure you stay true to your word. And as Milton Friedman once famously said, the way that you change things in the long run is not by getting the right people into office. The way that you truly change things, Milton Friedman said, is by creating a climate of public opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And I think we're reaching escape velocity when it comes to school choice. Even some Democrats are reading the tea leaves, and I don't care whether I would hope it's a true change of heart, but either way, whether it's a true change of heart or whether it's you just reading the tea leaves, that is good news for families in the end, that you have high-profile Democrats who are ahead in the polls by double digits feeling compelled to at least signal support for education freedom. Josh Shapiro even went on Fox News last year in 2023 reiterating his support for school choice. Now, I know he ultimately caved to the teachers' unions who gave him over $700,000 to his campaign in 2022, but it's still good news that he's in this predicament where he's still trying to explain why he does support school choice. He ultimately vetoed his own campaign promise. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it works out for him. But in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And in this position right now for Shapiro, he's doing a lot of explaining, and he has a strong incentive because there's a spotlight on the issue to actually follow through with his promise. The Wall Street Journal wrote about it again this year, their editorial board, pointing out that he still has an opportunity to follow through with this campaign promise and push for school choice to pass through both chambers, not just the Republican-controlled Senate. And so, look, in the U.S., we spend about $20,000 per student per year in the government-run schools. In private schools, Some are higher, some are lower, but on average, private schools spend about $12,000 or $13,000 when we're talking about tuition and fees. That's far less than what we spend in the government schools, an amount in the government sector which has increased by about 170% after adjusting for inflation. And outcomes, have they gotten 170% better? No, they obviously haven't. It's a bottomless pit, and it's the definition of insanity, throwing more money at the problem, doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results without changing the fundamental incentives within the system to do a better job. And in no time was this made more obvious than during the COVID era, where you had the private schools fighting to reopen and the government school unions fighting to remain closed. It wasn't just that they could keep their money regardless of whether they opened their doors for business. It was that they figured out they could actually profit from keeping the schools closed. They understood they could hold children's education hostage to secure billions of dollars in ransom payments from taxpayers. So they actually had an incentive to get more money. They were able to say, we're closed because we need more money. And that's what they've always done when it came to low test scores, failures in every other area, unsafe conditions. It's that they always need more money. Things don't get any better. Meanwhile, you have private schools that have figured it out. And think about it. It's only in K through 12 education where we have this problem, where you have a special interest fighting against the money following the person. Think about higher education. We have Pell Grants for low-income students. With college, you can take your Pell Grant taxpayer funding, you can take it to a public university if you want, you could take it to a community college if you want, but you don't have to. That money follows the student. You can take it, it's portable. You can take it to a private university, even a religious university. The funding follows the student. We do this with K through 12 too. Think about Democrats support the Head Start program, pre-K program. That money, you don't have to take it to an assigned government pre-K. You can take it to a religious, non-religious pre-K. Again, the money follows the decision of the family. Think about food stamps. We don't go to grocery stores that are run by the government that we're assigned to. That would be a problem. I think most people who are not far left socialists would not agree with that happening. And so most people are rational and understand when you have food stamps, if we're going to fund it, look, we can argue as libertarians and otherwise how much we should fund certain programs. The only argument that I'm making that is if we're going to fund some type of education or groceries for anybody, it should follow the decision of the family. And so you can choose Walmart if you want. I'm sitting here in Texas. If you want to go to H-E-B, you can do that. You can go to Trader Joe's. The funding follows your decision, not the government's. We fund people, not buildings. So with K through 12, we should fund students, not systems. Why is there a disconnect? Why would people support funding people as opposed to buildings for everything else, but not K through 12? It's a difference in power dynamics. Choice is the norm for everything else, for the most part. But when it comes to K through 12 education, choice threatens an entrenched special interest who wants to keep your kids in their institutions and keep the funding associated with your kids. They have a monopoly on money, but more importantly, they also see a monopoly on the minds of other people's children. So the parent revolution is important if you're a parent, obviously, but it's also important if you're not a parent, or even if you're not a grandparent, or even if you're homeschooling your own kids, because the government school system churns out 50 million kids per year where they're educating other people's children with their radical socialist ideology, where they're teaching kids to like big government, to think of big government as the solution to all their problems. Conservatives, libertarians, and rational Democrats, you can't win this war just by outpopulating them. You can't just have more kids, because the far left has figured out that they can raise your kids using the school system that they have infiltrated to raise your children for 13 years of their lives for 7 hours a day. As Vodi Bakum once said, we cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. Hey, Italians are great, John, but look, families need to be able to decide for their own kids. And the good news is Parents aren't surprised anymore, and we're seeing a revolution when it comes to education freedom like we've never seen before. And the best part about it is it's Randy Weingarten and the teachers union's own fault for stepping in it over and over and over again. Just a quick story. So I woke up a couple years ago. It's true, I wake up sometimes. I woke up today for this interview. It worked out. But I woke up a couple of years ago, and I thought it was a headline from the Babylon Bee. Look, these days you can't tell. Sometimes you don't know whether it's reality or a Babylon Bee satire headline because we live in such crazy times. But it wasn't a Babylon Bee headline. It wasn't a nightmare either. I woke up to a tweet by Randy Weingarten herself. And what was she saying? Well, right after the nation's report card scores came out, finding decades of learning loss that were partially caused by her union-induced school closures, she was in Ukraine tweeting that she was at the front lines to, quote, assess the situation. What in the heck was the teachers union boss from America doing in Ukraine at the front lines to assess the situation? Haven't the Ukrainian kids already suffered enough? You already ruined our schools. What are you going to do? Make their schools go remote over there like you did with ours? It's a total problem. And it just goes to show you that the unions have become more political and they don't focus on education. Just look at their timelines on Twitter. She likes to close her replies like she closed the schools. But it's nonstop bashing against Republicans, conservatives, and families aren't happy with that. They want the schools to stay in their lane. They want the schools to focus on education, not indoctrination. And when it comes to school choice, if you're listening and you're on the left, look, you should want choice too, because with a one-size-fits-all system, you're not always going to be in charge, or your ideas aren't always going to be perpetuated through that system. What if the right takes over a school board? And they are in some cases taking over school boards. You should want choice too, because that's the only way forward through freedom as opposed to force. Allowing families to take their children's education dollars to the schools that align with their values, which also gives an incentive for the public schools to up their game in response to competition, to do better on academics, but also just to focus more on reading, writing, and arithmetic as opposed to politically divisive concepts. Whether it's too far left or too far to the right, they'll have an incentive to cater to the middle, to not focus on politically divisive concepts. And in some states, like my home state of Texas, and in other red states like Tennessee, Idaho, Iowa, they have passed bills to ban CRT, for example, critical race theory, a Marxist ideology that divides kids based on their immutable characteristics. They've banned it, but there have been undercover journalists going into the school systems, interviewing them, and you have public school administrators admitting in this undercover video that they'll teach it anyway. It's a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. They just shift the goalpost, and they've said, oh, well, we'll just teach through a CRT lens, even if it's not explicitly in the curriculum. Or maybe we'll just call it social-emotional learning, or maybe we'll just call it student mental health services. That is the problem with the one-size-fits-all system. These top-down solutions are just Band-Aids. It doesn't strike at the root of the problem. And what the only true form of accountability is voting with your feet. We saw how democratic accountability works in the school system when families weren't happy and they got their mics cut off. They were labeled as terrorists. That is a fairy tale model of democratic accountability. It doesn't actually play out in practice as it is theorized. And so we need to allow families to vote with their feet. That is the only true form of accountability, bottom-up accountability.
So it's a very interesting thing. I wanna take a couple steps back and break down the landscape for those who aren't in the trenches the way you are with the issue. You know, for the parent who clicked on this because they're worried about where to send their kids to school, or they're not quite satisfied with the options they have right now. Let's actually break this apart, because you've covered a lot of ground already, and there's so much we could go into. So let's start with the teachers' unions themselves. So I think everyone understands what public schools are, that you live in a neighborhood, there is a district school in your neighborhood, That varies a little bit. Like here in Austin, there is some ability to choose between the schools that are the government run schools. But it's not limitless. It's not limitless. And when we moved, I used to live in Essex County, New Jersey, which was really interesting because Essex County contained within it some of the most challenging schools and some of the wealthiest schools in the country. So Glen Ridge, New Jersey, people would literally move into this tiny sliver of a town to send their kids to the high school and then immediately move out. That was like how they had school choice by virtue of being wealthy enough to move for the sake of the school. But also in Essex County is Newark, New Jersey, which was spending something north of $35,000 per student per year and delivering terrible results. And at the time when I lived there, then Mayor Cory Booker was in favor of school choice, as was his city council.
And he spoke at our summit at AFC. He spoke at one of our national summits.
So there was a boots on the ground understanding that this doesn't work that great for the most needy kids, despite pouring massive amounts of money on the thing. And I want to share a little anecdote that I don't mean to sort of indict my former neighbors, but it is what it is. I got all excited about school choice as I was reading up on all these ideas, and I was a new dad. I was like, we should have school vouchers. We should be able to like do all the stuff you're talking about. And my neighbors, who were absolutely my neighbors' parents, I should say, were card-carrying Republicans. They were public school teachers in New Jersey. And one of the things they said was, John, you don't want those Newark kids coming to our schools here in Verona. And that's a heartbreaking thing to hear, number one. I don't think they were racist per se, but I think they looked at that as, look, those schools are filled with lots of problems, behavior problems, crime. These are underprivileged kids. They've got a lot of trouble. Do you really, like, our schools are nice. The kids are nice. They're all middle-class kids. Do you really want that happening? And it was like such an encapsulation of how divisive it is to segregate our communities on the basis of where they can afford to live. So let's help for viewers who haven't thought about that before, dive into that for me. Why is it set up that way? How is it possible that this is, school segregation is one of the things that we learn about with regard to the Jim Crow South and Brown versus the Board of Education. And yet here we are essentially with de facto economic segregation in 2024.
Yeah, the schools are just as segregated today as they were a long time ago. So look, school choice, having the funding follow the child would actually be an equalizer. And so the left, when they label all these policies that they don't like as systemically racist, if we took their own definition, you could apply that to the government-run school system that does discriminate on the basis of zip code, has disproportionate outcomes based on race and income and other factors. And they're just highly segregated because you're assigned to your school based on zip code. We could break up those lines just by allowing the money to follow the child. So it's funny how you have the radical left who will use this as a hammer, the words systemic racism, to try to block any policy that they don't like. But when it comes to a policy they do like, namely the government school status quo that benefits the teachers unions who give money to the Democrat Party, they're completely silent on the issue. And it just goes to show you these accusations of racism have been more just used as a weapon to silence people that they don't want to hear from, or arguments that they don't want to hear, or try to block policies they don't like. And they don't bring that same energy to the policies that they do happen to like. And so we actually have 8 studies on this topic, summarized by EdChoice 123's of school choice. 7 of the 8 studies actually find overall positive benefits of school choice leading to more racial integration. And so if that's one of your goals, that is another side benefit of having choice, right? there's a whole lot of different benefits, but there's no reason we should set up a system. Just we don't set this up in any other area of life. It's just we aren't assigned to things. We aren't assigned to grocery stores. We're not assigned to a college. We're not assigned to a pre-K provider. But we do that with K through 12 education because you have a special interest who profits from that status quo. It's the teachers unions, and the good news is they are losing the control over the minds of other people's children. It's causing them to lose their own minds. And the more that red states continue this trend towards universal school choice, where the funding that would have followed you to the government school, you can take it somewhere else across the lines to another public school or to a private school or to a home-based education option, the more that blue states will have an incentive to come along, the more that will have Democrats defect on the issue. We saw this in Louisiana. Louisiana just became the 12th state to go all in on school choice. Everybody's eligible. They passed it with supermajorities in both chambers. In their House, they didn't need a single Democrat to vote for it. But guess what? 20% of their House Democrats actually voted for the bill the first time around. And so that's showing that the political winds are shifting towards our side. Think about in Illinois, deep blue state, J.B. Pritzker in 2022. He was the incumbent. He was already governor. And he was up by a lot in the polls. Right before the election, 3 weeks before Election Day, he answered a candidate survey saying he supported private school choice, the same program that he vowed to eliminate when he was first running for governor back in 2017. He even went to the Chicago Tribune last year, reiterating his support and saying that he would actually sign a bill to save the program if it got to his desk. Now, look, he might have known that there was no way in hell that bill was going to get to his desk. Maybe he talked to House and Senate leadership and knew that the bill was never going to make it. But again, that is a seismic shift in rhetoric from just a few years ago, where he would just be repeating the same tired teachers union talking points about how this was going to hurt the public schools and how that the families weren't going to choose the right options or whatever argument they were going to make, which, by the way, those are all garbage arguments. Parents know their kids more than anyone else. They care about their children more than anybody else, certainly more than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away who don't even know their children's names. So parents have the on-the-ground information and incentives to get that decision right. But the side benefit, it's a win-win solution, is that the public schools, it's a rising tide that lifts all boats. The public schools up their game in response to competition. Think about Florida. There are 11 studies out of Florida, 10 of them positive, finding more school choice, better outcomes in the public schools. Think about the trends in Florida over time. A couple decades ago, they were at the bottom of the pack on the nation's report card. Fast forward to today, the most recent nation's report card results have them at the very top, despite spending less than most other states. They're much lower than the national average on spending in Florida, but their outcomes are better. And even if you control for demographics across states of their students who live there, they're still at the top of the pack when it comes to the nation's report card scores. And they also have the U.S. News and World Report rankings finding Florida #1 ranking on education. So school choice has been a rising tide that lifts all boats. It's been a benefit in Florida. And guess what else happened in Florida? In 2022, DeSantis won by 20 points. We all remember that. But in 2018, he barely won. Most people don't remember this because of how well he did in 2022. He barely won by a fraction of a point. And the story in the Wall Street Journal the next day was that school choice moms tipped the governor's race in Florida. He was running against Andrew Gillum, a Democrat, who vowed to get rid of their private school choice program that was already benefiting over 100,000 kids, disproportionately low-income kids and non-white kids. CNN exit polling the next day found that black moms in particular came out in force for DeSantis. They might have disagreed with DeSantis on a lot of other issues, but they saw school choice as so important, getting their kid into a better environment, getting their kid a better future than the opportunity that they had was so important to them, they might have made that a single issue vote. And so fast forward to today, Florida has super majorities of Republicans in both chambers. So this could be, it's the right thing to do, obviously. It's a nonpartisan issue among the voters, and it could also be a political winner for the party who's the first mover. And in this case, it's the GOP picking up the football and becoming the parents' party. If the Democrats are smart, they'll see what's happening before their eyes and start to continue to defect on the issue, like we saw with in North Carolina and Georgia. We saw Republican legislators on the Democrat side in their House of Representatives in both states. They have flipped to the Republican Party on the issue of school choice. In North Carolina, this was a big deal because they just passed universal school choice. They needed that vote from the Democrat who flipped to Republican. Her name is Tricia Cotham. She was the primary sponsor on the universal school choice bill, and that made Roy Cooper, their hypocrite governor, really upset. He started stomping his feet, throwing a temper tantrum. If you go on to his government website today, Governor Roy Cooper, at the very top, you'll see in bright red, in big letters, a declaration of emergency. Was it because of a natural disaster? Is it because, I don't know, the failures in the public school system? No. He declared a state of emergency because he knew he didn't have the power to veto a school choice bill because they had enough votes on the Republican side to override his veto. So he was not happy about that. And talk about an abuse of emergency powers. They now have universal school choice in North Carolina. Roy Cooper sent his daughter to private school. I don't blame him for that. Every family should seek out the best educational opportunities for their own kids. But you shouldn't pull out the ladder from behind yourself and fight against school choice for less advantaged families. We see this with Joe Biden. He went to private school. He sent his kids to private school. Again, that's fine. More power to him. You should seek out the best options for your kids. But you shouldn't fight against other families having those same kinds of choices. And so we should put a spotlight on these hypocrites. There's too many of them in Congress, in positions of power, in Texas where we live. The chair of the Texas House Democrats, Trey Martinez Fisher, he's one of the loudest opponents of education freedom on the Democrat side in the Texas House. He sends his kids to private school. Again, I don't blame him for that. That's awesome. He should seek out the best options for him and his kids. But he shouldn't fight against school choice for other families, particularly against school choice for less advantaged families. And guess what? In Texas, after they blocked school choice last year, we now have the votes. After the primaries on Super Tuesday and in May, we picked up 14 votes for school choice. 21 so-called Republicans joined all the Democrats in the Texas House last year and voted against their own party platform issue of education freedom. Out of those 21 guys, 14 of them are gone. 14 are gone. That is a political earthquake. It basically never happens. Incumbents usually win their re-election 95% of the time. That trend was inverted in Texas, and it's because primary voters in particular are holding politicians accountable. And so for the first time in history in the Texas House, we now have the votes for universal school choice. The Senate has had the votes for a long time. Governor Abbott is a huge education freedom fighter. He's been pushing for the issue. He campaigned on the issue, supported people who supported school choice. And now Texas will be the next state in 2025 to pass a universal school choice bill. That's over 10% of all kids at the K through 12 level gaining access to universal school choice just by having Texas come along. That is a huge victory, and more states will probably follow suit.
So Texas is interesting to me because aside from being a very conservative state that is really a laggard on school choice, it does seem to represent some of the challenges that get faced politically with the issue. And I want you to help me understand what's going on here. Like, how could it even be the case that Texas doesn't have a more market-based approach to education? We're the so-called, red state in the nation. And, Texas, conservative Texas. How has this happened? How is it that school choice isn't already a thing here? I get that there's been a recent political shift, but I mean, there, as I understand it, there was a really huge push to try to make this happen before, unsuccessfully. Um, how has Florida had this for decades, and we're still waiting for the next legislative cycle?
Yeah, look, it wasn't a problem in the Senate. Back when we had a big push in 2017, the bill passed the Senate easily and it went to the House where it quietly died, just like it did last year. It did not pass the Texas House after we finally got a vote on the issue, but 21 of the so-called Republicans voted with all the Democrats. And these were the same guys who were already endorsed by the state affiliate of the NEA. They were already the union-controlled candidates. 18 of the 21 no votes, they were endorsed by the Texas State Teachers Association, the state affiliate of the largest teachers union in the country, the National Education Association. So this again has more to do with power and politics than anything else. But politicians like to pretend that they have an argument. So the conservatives in these deep red districts, the Republicans who pretend to be conservatives, they were trying to have their cake and eat it too for a long time. And so they would try to come up with excuses to throw at the wall to see what would stick. And one of the arguments that they kind of would hang their hat on for a long time is they would say two things that were logically incompatible with one another in the same sentence. On the one hand, they would say, first of all, the public school is the only option. They would say that, but then the next breath, with a straight face, they would look you in the eye and try to tell you that, well, school choice is going to defund my fantastic rural public school. Well, wait, hold on just a second. If it's so fantastic, you should have nothing to worry about. It's not going to defund your school because schools are funded based on enrollment. If no one's leaving, they're going to receive all their money still. But secondly, it can't be both of these things at the same time. It can't be that the public school is the only option and then families are going to leave. Where are they going to go? If the public school is the only option, well, then you should be the last person arguing that this is going to defund your school. The thing is, they were just listening to the status quo, who was afraid of any competition whatsoever, and that was the problem in these areas. And when you poll voters on the issue, if anything, rural voters tend to be more supportive of school choice than voters in urban or suburban areas. So if anything, those legislators should have been more likely to vote for school choice, not less likely to vote for school choice. And then if you think about it historically, not the 9 most rural states in the country, according to the U.S. Census Bureau data, already have some form of private school choice. That includes West Virginia, much more rural than Texas, and they were the first state to pass universal school choice with all families being eligible. And think about Maine and Vermont. These have the oldest voucher programs in the country. They actually started in the late 1800s. They found out over 150 years ago in Maine and Vermont that not having a lot of options was an argument to expand opportunities, not to restrict them. In fact, they've created these programs specifically for kids in rural areas that didn't even have public schools. So they'd give a voucher to the families to take to other nearby public schools or to private religious or non-religious schools. The funding followed the student. They figured this out over 150 years ago in the 1800s. And so again, not having choice is an argument to expand opportunities, not to restrict them. And so this has been the argument in Texas for a long time. It's falling flat. And voters finally, who thought the problems were only happening in California and other blue states, they've also seen that the gender ideology has gotten into the classroom in Republican areas as well. And they've turned this into a GOP litmus test issue. We saw this in the primaries in Texas this year. We saw this in Tennessee too. Think about in 2022. 10 of the so-called Republicans running for the House of Representatives in Tennessee in 2022, 10 of them were either endorsed or funded by the teachers union. 9 of them lost. 9 of them lost. That has become a GOP litmus test issue. Accepting the teachers union endorsement as a Republican post-COVID has become a form of political suicide. Think about in 2022 as well, nationwide. There wasn't really a red wave. There wasn't a blue wave. But there was a school choice wave. 76% of the candidates supported by my organization, the American Federation for children, won their races in 2022. And we didn't just play in the easy ones. We targeted 69 incumbents in state legislatures and took out 40 of them. That is the hardest thing to do in politics because, again, sitting legislators usually win their reelection historically about 95% of the time. So a political earthquake, a political reckoning is happening for Republicans who accept funding or endorsements from the radical left teachers unions. The jig is up, and parents and voters are holding their politicians accountable. In our home state of Texas, something else very interesting unfolded this primary session. Before the unions, the Texas AFT, the Texas State Teachers Association, I mentioned before, 18 of the 21 no votes were endorsed by the Texas affiliate of the NEA. And in the Texas, Randy Weingarten's affiliate of the AFT, they were endorsing Republicans too. Guess what happened this year? The Texas AFT made 77 endorsements. They were all Democrats. So the Republicans are seeing that it's icky to be associated with these radical left teachers unions, and the unions are also understanding that their public endorsement is hurting conservatives. Now, you can think of that as a good thing or a bad thing, but if you support school choice, that is a great thing that the unions are seeing it as dangerous to even be associated with the Republicans. That's going to help families in the end. It's going to make it more difficult for the unions to get what they want if they're having to hide behind closed doors. And that's what they did this year. They didn't publicly endorse Republicans, but guess what they did? They funded a PAC called Defend Rural Texas. Get this, it was a PAC that was set up in Austin, not in a rural area.
Right.
So they're just total gaslighting all around. But they funded this PAC, and the PAC funded some of the Republicans, like Ernest Bales, who lost his reelection by a large margin. Think about Glenn Rogers. I mean, this guy was just going down in flames against Mike Olcott. Glenn Rogers was the incumbent. He lost by 27 points. He was flailing right before the election. He challenged our agricultural commissioner, Sid Miller, to a duel, according to a headline from Texas Scorecard right before the election.
Like an actual duel with guns, like...
Yeah, duel. I mean, it got so pathetic. I almost felt bad for him until I remembered that he was joining all the Democrats to try to block kids from having better opportunities for their education and to try to trap kids in their failing government-run schools. So we got a new house, and we've seen this movie before. And I was trying to repeat this month after month, week after week, day after day, because we had seen this happen in Iowa. In Iowa, the running joke is that all the Democrats should have voted for Governor Reynolds' pared-down version of school choice back in 2022. It was a good bill, it was a step in the right direction, but it was only a few thousand students who could benefit from it. It passed the Senate easily, moved over to the House where it failed. The primary voters weren't having it. They got a new, more conservative House and passed full-throated universal school choice right away in January of 2023. And now Abbott in Texas is pointing out to local media that, well, the Democrats should have voted for the bill from last year because it's probably going to be even better this year, more expansive, and it might not have as many goodies for the government schools. They included about $7 billion in funding for the government schools in the bill last year, and the Democrats still turned it down. Why? Because it included $500 million for school choice. They turned down $7 billion because they were going to lose some kids to school choice because, one, they knew once school choice starts, families love it and it'll continue to expand. And two, more importantly, they want to trap your kids in schools that are controlled with their ideology, not parent ideology. They believe kids belong to the government institutions, not to their families. That's a huge problem. This should be alarm bells going off in everybody's head that they were willing to give up $7 billion just to trap poor kids in their failing government failure factories that we call schools. They're indoctrination centers. And if that doesn't make the case more clear than anything else, nothing will. They want to control your kids. That's a huge problem. And that's another reason why you should want opportunities for all families. We shouldn't want to control how other people have their children raised. They're not your kids. Families are the primary decision makers for their own children, not the government.
So it's interesting the ideological currents going on here because well, you have a pinned tweet. Now you reference sort of gender stuff, and you have a pinned tweet right now, which is I wish it was more shocking to me than it is. So this is right now, it was I'm looking at it here. It's the 2024 Texas Democratic Convention, Saturday General Session. So tell me about the contents of this tweet. We might play it as part of the show, but lay out what this is and how the heck it could possibly be happening right now.
Yeah, so the Texas Democrat Convention just happened in El Paso, Texas, and they had their featured speakers, and one of them was a drag queen that got up on stage and started repeating that we should free Palestine and do all these other political things, but then also bragged about how the drag queen would read do drag queen story hour in front of little kids and promoted that concept, but also even went further than that and promoted hormone blockers for children and promoted the idea that there's any such things as trans children. Right. And so this is just, look, Democrat, Independent, Republican, most people are not on board with this radical fringe ideology. And the Democrats, they went into this trying to say that, look, we need to go back to normalcy. This is not normal. And I don't care what you do on the weekends or what you do with your personal lives if you're an adult. I don't care, what kind of things you're interested in as long as you're not hurting anybody else. But when you try to push those ideas onto other people's young children, young impressionable minds, that's where most people have a problem with these ideas. And so if they would have just platformed the speaker and this speaker didn't say anything about drag queen story hour for young children, and if they didn't go as far as pushing hormone blockers for children, which are irreversible, can cause long-term damage to kids, I don't think anyone would have had a problem with it. The problem is, and look, this is why families are also pushing for school choice too. If they get a whiff of any of this kind of, if the schools are not focused on just the basics, if they're getting out of their lane into these other concepts, parents are saying, okay, I had enough. Even if my school's got an A rating from the state, even if my kid's report card looks fine. And I think that's also what has caused a seismic shift towards school choice momentum, is because a lot of families thought things were okay. They thought, hey, this is a blue ribbon school. My kid's getting all A's. My kid isn't complaining too much about what's going on. But then when they saw through Zoom school what was actually happening, they saw another dimension of school quality that is more important than anything that could be captured by a standardized test score, which is whether the school's curriculum and ideas are aligned with your own values. And I don't think most normal people aren't going to disagree with that. Like, if it's your children, you should direct how to raise your kids. If it's someone else's kids, maybe their parents should be in the driver's seat. And so, look, if you want to choose a school that does focus on some politically divisive concepts, you should be free to do that, and I'm not going to fight against your freedom to do so. But you shouldn't fight to trap my children in schools where I feel like they're being indoctrinated for 13 years of their lives for 7 hours a day. This is about parental rights. This is about freedom. This isn't really about public versus private. It's not teacher versus student or teacher versus parent. This is about the freedom to choose. And this should benefit teachers too, by the way. The teachers aren't getting a great deal out of the status quo. And in New Jersey, the Washington Post actually covered a story about a teacher who started a micro school during the COVID era. That teacher was in the system for decades. They were earning the same amount with the micro school, 5 to 10 children getting together in a household.
Yep.
They had a lot less red tape. They were able to structure the curriculum the way they wanted. They were able to have the policies that they wanted. They didn't have to deal with the government bureaucracy. They were earning about the same amount of money. And guess what? They had a fraction of the class size. Instead of 30, 40 kids, it was about 5 to 10 children. And so they didn't take the next step, the logical leap, to say, this is why the money should follow the child. More kids could access these opportunities, but 2, more of the funding could more directly go straight from the families to the teachers, as opposed towards all the administrative bloat. I mean, it's a total joke. It's a clown show. In America, since 2000, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the number of teachers and students in the system increased by about 7%, not too much. But since 2000, the number of administrators in the system, they increased by 90%.
Wow.
90%. It's become more of a jobs program for administrators than an education initiative for kids. That's a huge problem. And guess what? For teachers, their salaries have been stagnant since 1970. Their salaries in real terms have only gone up by about 10%. The spending in the system has gone up by about 170% over the same period in real terms. Again, it's not a funding issue, it's an incentive issue. The money doesn't make its way into the classroom. That's bad for kids. It's also bad for the teachers, but it's good for people like Randy Weingarten, who make over $500,000 a year to fight to close your schools, to fight for radical ideology to be pushed into your schools. But the teachers, they're not seeing the benefits. The kids aren't seeing the benefits. And look, in Texas, you got a handful of superintendents making more than President Biden, making over $400,000 a year. And for what? They're not doing a good job. And I wouldn't really have a problem with how much they make if they were in an open, competitive environment where families, if they're failing, could take their money elsewhere.
This is the thing that to come back to this sort of the radicalism for a minute. This is the part I find it so difficult to understand. This guy dressed in drag talking about reading stories to kids.
Okay, so it gets crazier. Everybody thinks it's a guy. It's actually a female who says she's non-binary.
Oh.
And so she's a biological woman pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. It just gets to multiple iterations of confusion. And this if anything, this is even weirder. And it's a reason why this should not be you should not be confusing children with all of this.
Well, so this is the part that I'm struggling with, because again, I'm with you. I'm a pretty libertarian guy. Like, I don't really care what you do in your bedroom. I don't care. You want to go to a bar and do whatever as an adult. We live in a free country. I want to keep it that way. It wasn't that long ago that this would have been an obvious no-go for a major political party. Like, this isn't like a Code Pink rally or something. This is the actual one of the 2 major political parties in the state.
Yeah.
And it's not just like the person got up and said all this stuff. I watched the clip and they're being cheered.
Yep.
So is this about the polarization in our society? Like, how do you understand? Like, why would you cheer for this? This is explicitly sexual content being talked about as belonging in front of our kids.
This same person posted on 4th of July last year in 2023, "I hate America, but I love this bikini." It was a picture of them in a bikini. And so the GOP in Texas right now must be having a field day. They're probably already creating campaign ads out of this. And why is it happening? Why would the Democrats think this is a good idea? I think too many people, it's kind of like the teachers unions. They don't really care that they're overplaying their hand and causing school choice to pass everywhere. I mean, Randy Weingarten's still going to keep her job. She's still going to make $500,000 a year. And the Democrats running the convention, I mean, they don't have a majority right now, and they probably know they're not going to have a majority. So they just went off the deep end, and they don't really care about winning elections. It might just be that this is something they do in their free time. And, you have the radicals controlling the party convention, and they just want to get more clicks. They just want to get more attention. And, you might have people who have gone so far left, and I don't even know if you can classify this on a left-right dichotomy. It's more of like a socialist ideology that they're pushing in too many of these conventions. And so I think the incentives are out of whack. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but you have people running the party who, they're just having fun, and they're just, or they're trying to get the Republicans to have backlash and say something stupid, but I don't know. I don't know what their decision. It's hard to guess why they would do something this stupid.
It's I think there's so many layers to this. So, if you're a viewer and you're like, look, I'm a progressive person. I want my kids to be exposed to the full spectrum of experiences that people have out there. And that, my neighbor's a gay couple. And so you can't keep that away from the experience. Their kid's going to go to school. They're going to talk about their two moms or their two dads. You've talked a lot about the political system at work here, but to come back to what it means for the progressive parent, what is the value proposition for school choice? You touched on it before, but let's spend a little time on this, because I think if there's any progressive still watching this conversation, they should understand the skin they have in this game, right?
Yep. Yeah, because you're not going to be the only ones in control of the schools of every school forever, right? So the problem is not more so about left versus right, but it's actually about who gets to decide for whose kids. And so in the current one-size-fits-all system, it's not even that a majority gets to inflict their will on a minority. It's usually that a minority special interest, namely the teachers' unions and whoever control them, get to inflict their will on the minds of other people's children. But, you have Moms for Liberty, you have other conservatives groups saying, aha, we're going to be a union too. We're going to flip the school boards. And when they're successful in doing that, and who knows, maybe they'll start to infiltrate the higher education institutions, the education schools who are currently very far left. Maybe you get some conservatives taking over those departments as well. I mean, look at right now with New College in Florida. You have Chris Rufo, a great activist for parental rights and education. He's on the board of New College. Richard Corcoran, I believe, is as well a conservative. And he was the former education secretary in under DeSantis in Florida. So you might envision a scenario for your grandkids, or maybe even your own kids later on in life, where you're in a scenario where there might be curriculum that's too far to the right, and you might not like that. You might want them to just focus on the basics, or maybe you're just in a school that's not doing a good job academically. I mean, the values-based argument is just one part of this. There's also academic quality also, and progressives should care about academic quality. And also, if you're a true progressive and you think that there should be equality of opportunities and that disadvantaged families should have choice, well, guess what? You should allow other families to have opportunities too. So there's a whole bunch of arguments as to why progressives and everybody else should support school choice. Those are just a few of them. And I actually did a poll, Real Clear Opinion did a poll on this during the COVID era. And I was thinking for a second, some states like in Florida and in Arizona, they were passing vouchers for kids who were assigned to public schools that had COVID mandates in it. So maybe there was a mask mandate. They actually passed in Florida and in both states. In Arizona too, you could get a voucher to go to a private school that didn't have a mask mandate. If you didn't like the COVID restriction with, maybe there's a vaccine mandate, maybe there was some other, maybe the school was just closed and they did virtual and nothing else. Well, they passed policies to allow vouchers to go to private schools that had kind of, COVID restrictions or settings that you preferred. Well, there was a poll out of Real Clear Opinion asking do you support school choice in general, but also would you support school choice if your public school had a COVID policy that you did not agree with. And so for the progressives, they were much more supportive of school choice if their public school did not have a mask mandate, if it did not
Right.
have some type of restriction that they agreed with. So again, like, everybody supports school choice. They support it for different reasons. And so I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal. I forget the headline. If you just Google it, you'll find it. But for them to just realize school quality is not one-dimensional. It's multi-dimensional. Families are choosing for a lot of different reasons, and not all public schools are created equal. Some are doing a good job, some are not. Some are more to the left, some are more in the center. You might find some in certain places that lean more to the right. You should be in favor of everyone just having a choice, even if you disagree with them. And then, by the way, who knows, maybe your job takes you to a state and locality where it's a different environment. You should support school choice too.
One of the things that I think is a challenge in the debate right now is you have what you're arguing for and what I also absolutely agree with, which is let's make this as market friendly as possible, which is to say, by market, we simply mean consumer driven, customer, client driven, student driven. Oh, I don't like the quality of this education for whatever reason. I get to vote with my feet. Just like, as you've already mentioned, Pell Grants and the GI Bill and food stamps and basically every other program. Every other program, more or less, doesn't say you have to go to this particular place. We have a Federal Trade Commission who, under the Biden administration, is incredibly active and is currently, for example, pursuing a antitrust case against Apple, who has a 25% global market share with the iPhone. Most phones are Android around the world. So 25% constitutes a monopoly, according to the FTC. But government controls 80 to 90%
Yep.
of school attendance across the states. So, like, there's all these incoherences in the system. We have a couple parallel threads about how to reform education in the country going on. There's what we've focused this conversation on so far, and what is your bailiwick: school choice. Make the money move with the student. Empower the parents to make the choice. Then you have what's happening in Florida, and this is perhaps at all levels, that Chris Rufo and Governor DeSantis are talking about, which is that, but then also trying to create actively more conservative choices and regulations, banning critical race theory and DEI, and creating explicitly sort of like Western Civ types of classical education institutions, but still inside of this government framework. And there does feel like there's tension there, because it feels like that second part of the process feels like it does create another war of all against all. So, okay, while DeSantis and Chris Rufo have power, they get to make the schools look like what they want, even if I like that. But then the door has been opened to just swing it in the exact opposite direction. How do you think about that tension? Is it that you kind of have to do both? You have to be simultaneously trying to get the political system to have the schools reflect your values, because that's the system we're in, and also make it so that wouldn't be necessary because it's a market-based approach?
They don't have to happen at the same time, but I think they're happening concurrently, because the reason that we've been seeing so much success on the school choice front is because of the values misalignment. Conservatives are not happy with the curriculum in the public schools, or just how the teachers are teaching said curriculum. And so they're just trying to find solutions to their problems. One of the solutions is school choice. Another one, let's ban the concepts we don't like. Let's elevate the concepts we do like. And so I don't blame them for being in search for a solution. They're doing the same thing that the left has done in blue states, where they've promoted their kind of view of utopia in the public school system using state policy. So the conservatives, look, they can't just sit there and do nothing. So they're going to fight back to try to control the public schools in the way that they see fit. But I think the best solution is that bottom-up solution with school choice. One, if you think about the bans in particular, they're unenforceable. It's a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. Maybe some teachers knock it off once you pass it, but there are other rogue teachers who are just going to do what they want once the doors close. You don't have cameras in the classroom. That's not a policy that's going to pass anytime soon, even though we have cameras in daycares and other areas of life. So I don't think that's going to have any political support for a very long time, if ever. But school choice is the only policy that actually respects everybody's individual freedom to choose for their own kids. But again, when it comes to bans on critical race theory or gender ideology at a young age, the conservatives are just basically responding to what the left has done for decades. They've always controlled the school system, so they're trying to push their values into the schools as well. So if they want to do that, fine. There are other policies that I point to in the back of the book, The Parent Revolution, where we can tweak the system, right? So you might be in a state that school choice isn't going to pass anytime soon. Maybe you're in California. You can push for other policies to increase your chances of winning in the future or to try to improve the public schools. So one thing you could do is try to pass a policy. It should be pretty simple, and some school districts have done this in California already, is to pass a policy not to keep secrets from parents about the child's gender ideology. So the policy in Chino Unified School District in California, for example, is they passed the policy to say, if your child changes their gender at school, you better tell the parents. It seemed like a very basic policy, but the state attorney general, Bonta, was not very happy about that and brought the heavy hand of the state down on the district to try to keep sexual secrets about children from their own parents. So that's a huge problem. But at least if you push to try to promote these very basic policies, even if it's not full-throated school choice, what we would ultimately want, you can have the other side overplay their hand. This is a political disaster for them, to where they're not always going to be able to keep this up. So you might as well fight, even if you lose in the short run. In the medium to long run, they're going to expose themselves for being socialist, and most people, Democrat, Republican, Independent, are not. They think that parents should be in the driver's seat. Another policy could be, look, you could just align the school board elections, very simple, with the general election. Most school board and education elections are at random times, not with the general election. Why? Because the unions know that if it's a small turnout, they have an outsized influence. It's the nature of special interest politics. They'll be able to determine the outcome of that election, or they'll have a much higher likelihood of doing so. So they'll fight tooth and nail against making higher turnout for education elections. The same people who call Republicans a threat to democracy or say that Republicans are engaging in voter suppression, the status quo in education, they fight to suppress the vote only when it comes to education policies, because they want to handpick their candidates for school board. They want to make sure they're millions and billions of dollars in bonds that are extorted from the taxpayer. They want to make sure they're the only ones voting so that they can extort more money from taxpayers. So there's a lot of these things like this that I included in the book that should be no-brainers, that the other side is going to fight against, that gets them to reveal themselves.
That fact is so indicting and so poorly understood that we are told we have a local school system that's locally governed, and yet you have outside political agents funding our politicians who regulate the system ultimately at the state level. But then that you have, it's like worse than gerrymandering, that you actually have the elections placed at random times that aren't when everyone takes off from their job to go and pull the lever in November. It's like, no, it'll be in May or June or who knows. Only the motivated are going to be engaged in that. And that is just so shocking to me, that this remains the case as a matter of policy, that we can actively, it's, in software, they call this dark patterns, right? So it's like,
Yep.
oh, Facebook is using dark patterns to try to keep you from opting out of their AI grabbing all your data as you go. So that's little tricks to get you to do the thing that you didn't really want to do, or make it really costly and annoying to do the thing you want to do, so that you give up. I mean, how it's so much worse than, for example, just asking people to prove that they're the person they say they are, like every other country on the planet, as far as having voter ID. It's like voter ID is so much less intrusive and so much less of an imposition than having you have to go to a second, randomly placed off-axis election for the thing that's actually probably more important than the ones that happened in November.
And this is also why Texas still doesn't have private school choice. And we're going to get it done in 2025. But for a long time, it's an open secret. Everybody knew it was happening. The government school districts were illegally influencing elections. It's against the law in Texas to use public taxpayer resources and school emails to tell employees they have to vote a certain way, whether it's for this candidate or that candidate, or whether it's for the bond or against the bond. You cannot do that using school district resources. And everybody's known it, but the mainstream media, they were never going to report on it because it was against a policy that they supported. They wanted more bonds to pass. They wanted anti-school choice people to be voted into office. They wanted Democrats to win. And so the mainstream media didn't report on it. Well, guess what? We have social media now, and I've been putting it all over the internet, evidence from whistleblowers showing that the superintendents and other public school administrators this year illegally influenced elections. So in this case, in Texas, in Denton ISD, for example, we've gotten 2 criminal indictments already. I'm on the board of Liberty Justice Center, and we sent those sworn affidavits from citizens to local district attorneys in the area, and they've gotten 2 criminal indictments already. And it's because, look, and so this is a way that they were able to put their thumb on the scale for a very long time to tell their employees that they got to vote for the person who's against school choice, or they got to vote for the bond. This happened in San Antonio. I live here in San Antonio, grew up here. In my home district where I went to school, the superintendent, his name is Brian Woods. He works for the Texas Association of School Administrators now. It's funny how that works out. But in 2022, his district was illegally influencing the bond election, telling employees to go vote for the bond. You can't do that. And in his district emails, he was implying that the teachers were not going to get raises next year if they didn't go vote for the bond. You can't do that. Once the Attorney General's office got whiff of this, all of a sudden, this superintendent, he was my old superintendent, making over $350,000 a year at a young age, he magically retired and went to go work for the superintendent's union. I wonder why that might be. But at the end of the day, you have some of these, this is still happening in 2024. Ken Paxton, our attorney general in Texas, he sued 7 school districts for this issue this year alone. And the thing is, in Texas, the attorney general, he can sue, but it's more like a slap on the wrist. There's no criminal attachment to that lawsuit. It requires a local district attorney to prosecute in criminal ways. And so in Texas, if you have enough affidavits signed, you can trigger a mandatory investigation by the local district attorney. And so that's what happened in Denton. And that's in the process of happening in Huffman ISD in Texas as well. I've released audio from a required meeting for all of the employees at Huffman ISD at one of their school campuses. On the school campus, their superintendent, I have the whole recording that I shared on social media on X, which is formerly known as Twitter, him telling the employees that they got to go vote for the Sweet 16, which was the guys who voted against school choice. And he said, oh, by the way, someone asked if they were going to get raises next year. He said, "There's no way you're not getting raises," and that's because the right people weren't in office. And so this is, I mean, it's just people knew this was going on. We've talked about it in policy circles for as long as I can remember in Texas. It's just nothing ever happened because we thought it was unenforceable. We didn't have the goods, and now with social media, brave whistleblowers, and places like Liberty Justice Center, and Ken Paxton's been helpful too, just putting a spotlight on the issue. And employees don't want to be told how they must vote anymore. They want to have the right to go to work and not be indoctrinated by their employers and threatened, saying that they won't get a raise if they don't vote how their employer wants them to vote.
This is this thing that, is so strange, right? So I've talked to a lot of people about this, about well, what's going on with the relationship between teachers and the teachers' unions and the dynamics. And how I understand it is, if you go into any random school district in this country, you will find that more or less the teachers in their local public school basically look like politically the community.
Yep.
If you go to Berkeley, California, the teachers are going to look like the people of Berkeley. If you go to Kyle, Texas, they're going to look like the people of Kyle, Texas. They're your neighbor. They basically don't, maybe they lean a little left. It's obviously much more female than male. There's some dynamics that are different than the general population, but by and large, teachers are a politically diverse group. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, they lean a little bit more left, but on average, it's not like the teachers unions donations where it's 99% to Democrats. It's much more balanced than when you look at the union bosses.
Yeah. So then what you have is this thing that I also understand most people don't realize, which is that, FDR and LaGuardia in New York during the Grand New Deal, the great next wave of progressive politics in America that all of our kids get taught was such a great thing instead of sort of fascism, which is what it actually was. I mean, like literally it was fascism, like FDR's brain trust were inspired by the fascists. They were against public sector unions.
Yep.
And they were against I know you know this, but for the audience, they were against public sector unions for a reason that is obvious as soon as it's pointed out to you. And that is that when you have a public run entity, it has a certain monopoly power, which is to tax you and take your money whether you like it or not. If it has a union, if its employees are unionized, that is a monopolistic position that the union now holds. So whether I like it or not, the state of Texas is going to tax me. Travis County is going to take a lot of money from me at the end of this year for my taxes. That money is then going to go into the state, and then 50% of it is going to end up getting spent in the schools. 50% of all state spending is on the schools. And then that all ends up in the pockets of the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions, as you said, take that money, which has been extracted coercively from all of us as parents and as non-parents, and spend it politically to essentially buy their negotiating partner with at the table. When I was in New Jersey, Governor Corzine at the time, I remember this because it was so shocking. He was at an election rally, and he said it was a teachers union rally, and he said to the teachers unions, "I'm with you." That's like the CEO of Ford going to a rally with the United Auto Workers Union and saying, "I'm with you." It's like I'm literally, it's just definitionally corrupt. So shouldn't we just ban these entities? Shouldn't it be illegal to form a union if you're a public sector employee?
Yeah, we should ban public sector unions, all of them. And so the main problem is that you can't vote with your feet as a customer to hold them accountable. Yes, it's a huge problem that they're using our own public taxpayer resources against us. They use public dollars to lobby against the public. It's insane. I mean, look in Chicago with Mayor Brandon Johnson. He was a union organizer for the Chicago Teachers Union. Now he's the mayor.
Right.
Funny how that works. They use their political power to hire the people that they're supposed to be negotiating with. They're negotiating with themselves. And so that's a problem. But also when they closed the schools, which is basically a teacher strike on a national level, and they got to keep your money. The doors were closed. They kept your money. Families were scrambling, trying to get their kids into private schools that were magically open. The daycares were open, groceries, everything else was open.
Yeah,
Except for
Catholic
the
schools, they were all
government-run schools.
open.
Well, actually, in Sacramento County, there was a stupid health order that applied arbitrarily to close daycares, but not schools. Because COVID was smart. It knew if you were learning something, it was going to activate. It was going to get you. But if not, if you're in the same building and you're just twiddling your thumbs and we called it a daycare, COVID would let you go. It was also a courteous virus. If you were on planes during COVID, you might remember that once you had to eat during the plane and everybody put their mask down, COVID said, okay, I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to let you continue to eat your meal. I'm not going to activate until you're done eating. It was a courteous virus. It was a smart virus. But there was a private Christian school in Sacramento County who saw how stupid this was and said, wait a second. They rebranded themselves as a daycare. They trained all of their employees as daycare workers so that they can open to meet the needs of their customers, the families, because they knew if they were closed much longer, because they weren't getting money in tuition, they might have to close their doors for good. And that just goes to show you how backwards the incentives are that are baked into the government school system. You had Chicago Teachers Union bosses vacationing in Puerto Rico thousands of miles away, saying they couldn't go back to work because it was too unsafe. Yeah, they were deleting tweets saying it was racist to reopen the schools. They were creating interpretive dance videos to protest going back to work in Chicago. If you thought the kids had it bad with math and reading scores, they're really screwed if they want to figure out dance, because the dance video was horrendously done. The production was horrible. They didn't know what they were doing, but they went out of their way to do that instead of just going back to work. And so it was just nonstop lunacy during the COVID era. But with public sector unions, when they closed the schools, the families had no recourse. They couldn't. If we had school choice and the funding followed the child, we wouldn't have school closures as long as we did. In Chicago, they were striking in 2022. 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation. So in the private sector, I have no problem with if Walmart had a bunch of employees who wanted to go on strike. Well, guess what? If the employees went on strike, the employer would feel the pain and they'd have to choose from a couple of options. They'd either have to fire all of them or they'd have to change. If there was actually a policy that was hurting the employees and it wasn't fair, they'd have to change their policies. But with the school system, when they closed the schools during COVID or when they strike routinely, they did in Massachusetts this year. I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal. In Newton, Massachusetts, they went on strike this year. Despite, guess what? It's illegal to go strike in Massachusetts, but they do it anyway because they get away with it every dang time. But the employer doesn't feel the pain because the customers are the ones who get the short end of the stick. The district still gets the money because families can't vote with their feet somewhere else. And so there's this broken, the feedback loop is broken. The employees might be striking because there might be something actually wrong with the employer, but if the employer is not feeling that pain, there's no feedback back and forth, and the customers are the ones that are getting screwed. That's a problem, and that's why these teacher strikes are going to continue throughout the country. That's why the public schools are not going to get better until you have meaningful competition. And at the end of the day, if we have funding following the student, I won't have that as much of a problem with unions even in the government school system. I think they push for evil things. I think they push to protect themselves at the expense of children. But if we had universal school choice, at least we could incentivize them to maybe focus on things that they're actually supposed to be focusing on, like improving teacher benefits instead of locking kids in their schools, and instead of pushing divisive concepts into schools as well.
If as we start to come to the end of our time together, there's a lot of different. We've talked about school choice in a blanket way, but there's lots of different ways it can be implemented. And help me understand, what do you see as the optimal policy? If I'm watching this because I'm an active parent and I want to be able to understand what kind of idea I should be looking for from my elected officials, so that they and understand what it actually is. What is like the gold standard of universal school choice?
Tell them to pass education savings accounts. This is the gold standard of universal school choice. It's much like a health savings account, where the funding that's meant to follow you to the government school, you can take in the form of an education savings account directed by the parent. You can use it to pay for private school tuition and fees, much like a voucher. But you can also use the funding for homeschool curriculum, special needs educational therapies, micro schools, what a lot of people were calling pandemic pods during the COVID era, 5 to 10 children getting together in a household, homeschool co-ops. It's the purest form of the money following the child. But like an HSA for health savings account, you can't use the money on drugs or things that are not approved. It has to be approved education expenditures, and that's about as free market as you can get, while making sure the funding is still meant for education, is being used on education. And in places like Arizona, I'd say this is the best way to do it. Arizona has all these anti-regulation stipulations explicitly in the statute that you are not a government actor if you're taking the money. You don't have to teach the public school curriculum or test. And so that's the way to do it. You want to be as light touch regulation as possible. They just have a random annual audit to make sure, again, you're not spending the money on nefarious activities, that it's being used on education activities. And I think that's pretty reasonable, even for your most hardcore libertarians, to make sure that taxpayer funding is being used on education and not other activities. So in Arizona, they do this. The government schools spend about $14,000 per kid per year. If you still want that opportunity, if you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but for real this time, and they do get better. But if not, $7,000, the state portion of the funding, follows you to a savings account directed by the parent. Again, can be used for any approved education expenditure. It can even roll over from year to year. Let's say you're going to a low-cost Catholic school for elementary school, and let's say it's only $5,000 a year. In Arizona, they have some that are that low. You can save the extra $2. You can use it for tutoring or other expenses, but if you don't spend all of it in 1 year, you can save it for high school, which tends to have a higher tuition than an elementary school. And then in some cases, if you're done through K through 12 and you still have money left over, you could even use it for post-secondary education as well for 4 years. And it might not be a case in a lot of cases, because this is half of the amount that what is spent in the public schools. And by the way, this saves taxpayer money at the same time. You're spending half the amount that you would have spent in the government-run school system per student, but you're also giving families more freedom to choose at the same time.
The claim, the criticism that gets made, is that you've said it a couple times. Oh, you're taking away, you're defunding the local school. But I think that there is this claim that isn't entirely legitimate, which is to say, look, what you're going to have is, it's not enough money to go to the best school. It's enough money to support, someone who already can afford, or at least is like at the margin can afford, to send their kids to the private school. And so what's going to happen is that the public school that currently exists, that's doing a terrible job, or doing not a good enough job to keep students because the parents are pulling their kids out, is just going to get worse, because now the engaged parents are leaving and its funding is shrinking as it loses enrollment. And what about the kids whose parents don't have one extra nickel. They still have to send their kid to this school, or, it's physically close in proximity and the only other options are going to cost them in other ways, like having to figure out how to do private transportation to get them to the school, or, there's all kinds of other costs involved in making these choices besides just the tuition. And so you're setting up a system that's going to increase inequality of outcomes and make it more subject to wealth effects and entrenched sort of economic inequality. What's your answer to that criticism? I hope I did it justice, given that I think it's nonsense. But
inequality is built into the government-run school system today, and so having the funding follow the child, even if it's only $7,000 to $10,000, that's still a step in the right direction towards expanding equality of opportunity. The most advantaged are the ones who have school choice today. They can afford to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. They're the ones who are more likely to be able to afford to live in the best neighborhoods that are assigned to the best quote-unquote public schools. And so giving more families opportunities expands opportunities for more families than who previously had them. And by the way, the people who are saying that, $7,000 isn't enough to cover tuition, there's a whole range of different tuition in private schools. The national average is about $10,000 to $12,000 per student. And in Arizona, the median tuition, I'm quoting 7,000 because I was talking about the Arizona Scholarship Program. That's the state portion of funding there. It's $7,000 per student per year. Their median tuition, according to a report by Goldwater Institute for private schools, is about $7,000. So that covers about half of the private schools in the state of Arizona. And so just because you can't access 100% of the schools, you were able to access 0% of them before. Now you can access 50%. That is a huge step in the right direction. We shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good, and we should take any win we can when it comes to expanding opportunities. And when you look at families and just look at the data in other locations, in D.C., they've been doing this for a while. They've had their D.C. voucher program for a long time. The scholarship's only about $10,000 to $12,000 per student. Average public school spending per student in D.C. is about 3 times that amount. It's over $30,000 per kid in the government schools. So you have low-income families, average household income in D.C. using this program, about $30,000 per household per year. 95% of the kids are Black or Hispanic, and they're still flocking to this program. Thousands of kids use it each year. Thousands are on the wait list each year trying to get their kids better educational opportunities, and they're able to figure it out. They're able to either get private scholarships from the school itself, because you may have a sticker price of $15,000, but they may say for low-income kids, you only have to pay $8,000 to $10,000. It depends on the school, but that is often the case as well. And so this has worked out in several locations in Florida. Before they went universal, they now have like 400,000 scholarships awarded this year in Florida. But before, in 2018, they had about 100,000 scholarships awarded. The data at the time showed about an average household income of about $35,000 to $40,000 per year. And so, it's not like super wealthy that are using it. But at the end of the day, no one should be forced to pay twice. We don't discriminate when it comes to access to government schools based on income. We kind of do based on zip code. But everybody can go to a government school regardless of your income. We shouldn't discriminate when it comes to access to school choice on the basis of income either. And so no family, whether you're high income, low income, you should be able to take your child's education dollars. Look, wealthy families are paying into the system. They might as well get the average amount back to be able to pay for private school tuition and fees as well if they'd like. But a lot of the same people who make this argument that this is not enough, they would never support an amendment to increase the scholarship amount. Hey, increase it to what's being spent into the government schools. They would vote against that every step of the way. And why would they do that? They would say, this is defunding the public school, which is what they always say. And at the end of the day, when it's only $7,000 or half following the student, the government schools financially benefit on a per student basis. They're keeping the local dollars. They're keeping the federal dollars. And so on a per student basis, they're actually better off than they were before. It's like, imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and you wanted to go to Trader Joe's or somewhere else, and Walmart got to keep half your grocery funding each week, even though you weren't shopping there. That would make 0 sense, but that's how politics works sometimes. Walmart would be happy with that deal. I would argue that this is a fantastic deal for the government schools, that they get to keep any money at all, thousands of dollars per student per year, for students they're no longer educating. So again, this is a win-win solution. It's a win for the kids who get a choice, but it's also a win for the kids who remain in the public schools, and it's a win for the school system that they get to keep any money at all. It should be 100% of the dollars follow the student. That's not how politics works sometimes. You got to create winners on each side of the aisle and to make a deal happen. And so it turns out to be a win-win solution. And the public schools get better. There are 29 studies on this subject nationwide. 26 of those 29 studies find positive effects. More school choice, better outcomes in the public schools.
The argument for government doing things, there's multiple arguments for the government doing things, and in the spectrum of politics, you can be on the far free market individualist side. You could say government should do nothing, or that government should just sort of protect the borders and keep us from being invaded. Or you could say, well, the government should mostly leave us alone, but maybe have a little like social insurance to keep people from falling through the cracks at the worst case scenario. Or you could go all the way to just like communism. Like the government should plan 5-year society from the top down, and maybe they're elected and maybe it's democratic socialism, but it's democratic in this case is especially two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner. But that's the spectrum here. And among the arguments for when government should step in is, are things a natural monopoly? This is like sort of Econ 101. Is there a natural monopoly? Like, oh, well, once you've run the power lines, maybe it's hard to have competition, so it's kind of a natural monopoly to have an electrical service provider. That's proven not to be true, but that's a Blackboard version.
Oxymoron, natural monopoly.
Yeah, or there's externalities. So pollution needs to be regulated, because if somebody's spewing particles into the air and it's falling on into your environment, you don't have any control over them. So this is where the government steps in. I'm not aware of any argument that outside of essentially the Communist Manifesto for the government operating schools. So
government schooling is included in the communist planks in the Communist Manifesto. But the so-called economic argument that you'll hear people perpetuate, it's a myth when it comes to the government school system. They'll say the government needs to run schools because it's a quote-unquote public good. It's more like a public bad in places like Baltimore, where they have 40% of their high schools with 0% proficiency rates in math. 0 kids in 40% of their public schools having proficiency in math. It's a total clown show. It's a disaster. It's a dumpster fire. That is not a public good. But the argument they'll say is that the two conditions of a public good is that it has to be non-rivalrous and non-excludable, according to the economics definition.
Right. So this would be like the national
public
parks.
Schools are both of those things. They are excludable, and they also are rivalrous in consumption. So, and evidence for this is that private schools exist. It is not a public good. You don't have a freed rider problem. You can limit it to payers. And look, public schools do exclude on the basis of zip code as well. So they aren't just excludable, they do exclude. And even Milton Friedman wrote about this in 1955 in The Role of Government in Education in his essay, where he pointed out that even if there were positive externalities of schooling, which, by the way, schooling is not the same thing as education, you can get a good education outside of those walls. And there's a lot of negative externalities of schooling too, where you might learn that it's cool to be in a gang, it's cool to do drugs. And I had a lot of those influences in my government school experience growing up in San Antonio, Texas, in my middle school. We'd play this game called 10 Seconds. That was the cool thing to do. You fight for 10 seconds, and then that was the end of the game. I mean, we had kids get rolled into the gang in the bathroom. That was the cool thing. I didn't do it. I didn't fall through the cracks, but kids do fall into the cracks when they're surrounded by that for long periods of time, for several years. And that's not a public good. That's a public bad. They're better off being at home with their parents, not being around these influences. But all that to say, Milton Friedman pointed out that even if we all agreed that there were net positive externalities of schooling, that it was a great thing to do, and that what he means by externalities is that there are benefits to people who don't directly engage in the transaction. So it's beyond what the kid experiences. It's beyond what the school or provider's experiencing, is that these third parties, the rest of society, benefits if everybody's super educated. I would say, one, the kind of individuals that the government school system is churning out is not a benefit for third parties. We saw what happened with the riots in over the past few years, mostly peaceful protests. I think teaching kids to not like each other based on immutable characteristics and dividing kids in the government school system, that is leading to negative externalities, not positive externalities. But even if we agreed that everything was positive, that this was a good environment, Milton Friedman pointed out that that doesn't necessarily imply that government should be running the schools. That would only imply that there might be some benefit of having taxpayers fund a certain portion of schooling at the K through 12 level. And even then, there's no reason why we should structure it where we're funding government schooling for everybody, including Bill Gates' kids.
Right.
I mean, the argument for food stamps is that there's a benefit of having a well-fed populace, and that we don't want people starving. But then do we say, oh, let's give food stamps to Bill Gates? No, we say it should just be for the least advantaged who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. And so you could imagine a society, if we started from scratch, where with education, we'd have education stamps. They'd all be private providers. You don't need the government to run the institutions. And you wouldn't need to fund it for the highest of incomes. You'd fund it for a small segment of the population. But these aren't policy proposals I'm arguing for right now. I understand the world that we live in today, and the best solution from a realistic standpoint is to have the funding we're already allocating to K through 12 fund the kid as opposed to the institution, to fund the student, not the system.
I think viewers have gotten a really robust understanding of what school choice is, of where it is in our country today, which is what your book is so good at. And what you've articulated here. You know, this is a movement that's on the march. So I know that you're optimistic about it. You are an evangelist for school choice. So you are very much. I mean, I think that might even be in your Twitter handle, isn't it?
Right.
You know, school choice evangelist. So I think that's pretty obvious. What has you most optimistic and excited, not just about school choice, but education, because in America, because school choice policy is exciting. It's exciting for me. The path of education in the country seems like it's on the ropes. And so is that the 1-2 step? How do you think about the future for the country and for education?
I'm most optimistic about the bipartisan future that we have on the front for school choice. In the book, in chapter 4, I highlight something that I call bipartisanship through hyperpartisanship. And it might sound counterintuitive right now. How can something so politically divisive actually be bipartisan or nonpartisan in the future? Well, it has to do with something, a little known reality, that politicians respond more to power than to logic or morality. And so the more that the GOP leans into parental rights as a political winner, the more it becomes a form of political suicide for Democrats to oppose it. And so we're seeing a lot of the things that I called in the book about this theory playing out in practice right now, where you have Democrats either signaling public support for school choice or they're even voting for it in places like Louisiana and Florida last year. 11% of the House Democrats in Florida voted for school choice, universal school choice. Again, that's not 90%, 100% where I'd like it to be, but it's a huge shift from where we've been before, where all Democrats have historically locked arms and fought against school choice. You have consequential votes in places like Nebraska this year. They passed their first school choice program. And guess what? In Nebraska, you need a 2/3 supermajority to break a filibuster. They needed 33 votes. They got 33 votes with the help of Justin Wayne, one of their main Democrats out there. He pointed out the hypocrisy of his colleagues for sending their kids to private school who wouldn't dare send their own children to the failing schools in his district in Omaha, Nebraska. And so that was courageous of him. In Louisiana, you have Representative Jason Hughes. He pointed out in a powerful speech on the House floor that he didn't care if he lost his job over this. This was too important. This vote to expand opportunities for less advantaged families to have school choice, this vote was too important. It wasn't worth selling his soul to the teachers' unions. And so that was important. Jason Hughes is a big supporter of school choice in Louisiana. In Missouri this year, they had a few votes from Democrats voted for their big expansion of school choice this year in Missouri. In Georgia this year, they passed their first education savings account program, money following the child. After Governor Brian Kemp called for it to come to his desk, this is the first time any Georgia governor has done so, called for a private school choice bill to come to their desk during their State of the State address early on in the year. He was the first one to do so. A Democrat was a consequential vote and voted for the bill to enact their first education savings account program. Just after last year, Misha Maynor, a Democrat, flipped parties as a sitting legislator to become a Republican on the issue of school choice in particular. So again, a lot of the things I talk about, it seems like it's partisan because it's the Republicans winning on the issue, but in order for things to change, in order for the incentives to align for politicians to do the right thing, you have to have one party. I don't care if it's the Republicans or the Democrats. If the Democrats were leading on the issue, I would applaud them for doing so. The Republicans in that other scenario would have an incentive to come along as well. Currently, since the Republicans are winning on the issue, the Democrats are scratching their heads and saying, you know what? We got to listen to this new interest group, the parents, the kids union. If we don't want to continue bleeding votes on the issue, we got to do the right thing. And so now you have people like Josh Shapiro, J.B. Pritzker signaling public support for private school choice. And again, you might not like these people for a lot of other reasons, but it's good news for families in the end that you have powerful politicians from both parties feeling compelled to outmaneuver themselves to fight for school choice. We saw this with Joe Biden too. Joe Biden sucks. He does not support school choice. He's a hypocrite on the issue, but he's even been tweeting out some messages along the lines of, your zip code shouldn't determine your education. School choice advocates have been saying this for decades. And that he's not saying that because he supports school choice, but at least he's understanding that the messaging is powerful enough that he needs to try to co-opt that message and to try to signal to voters at least that he supports some type of educational opportunities.
I asked this of every guest, we call this Dad Saves America because I think dads have an important role to play in our families and our communities and the country, and that if we want to save the country, if we believe in a vision of the country, that's positive, our choices, we've been talking about choice this entire conversation, as parents are probably the highest, most important role we're going to play. How do you think about your role in the American story?
I'd like to be here to motivate parents, to show them that if they stick their neck out, they're not going to be the only ones. They have people fighting, rooting for them to win the war that the unions have waged on their children for far too long. And I think it's been part of the secret sauce over the past few years. Parents thought that maybe they thought they were the only ones who had a problem with the school system. They thought that they were going to look bad. They thought there was going to be retaliation. If they showed up at the school board meeting, then everybody was going to boo them, that the school system was going to take it out on their kids. Well, now we've seen with example after example that with the School Boards Association, when they waged a war on parents, implying that they should be under the Patriot Act labeled for domestic terrorism, 26 states left the School Boards Association. That didn't happen out of nowhere. It's because parents were pissed off. They locked arms. They became a political juggernaut to be reckoned with, and politicians are finally listening to them. And so we should keep our foot on the gas. I want to be here to motivate you. I want to be here to tell you that you can win. That is an important battle for you to win. Even if you're more focused on tax policy or something else, this is a battle for you, because those kids going through the school system, even if they aren't your kids, even if you're not a parent right now, even if you're homeschooling your own children, the socialists running the schools are teaching the kids to like big government as the solution to all their problems. Guess what? Those kids are going to turn out to raise your taxes later on by taking that ideology to the voting booth. And so this is a battle for the future of our country. It's a battle for the right to educate your own kid as you see fit, obviously, but it's much bigger than that. It's a much more important spiritual battle in a way than that. It's a battle about the direction of our country and how divided we're going to be or not. And it's a battle, again, most importantly, about you having a say in your own child's education. You are powerful. Even if the unions want to laugh at you and say that you aren't, it's because they're afraid of you. They're shaking in their boots right now. They're losing control over the minds of other people's children. It's their own fault, and they can't stand it. They've been drunk on power for so long, they don't know what to do. They're quadrupling down on their anti-parent rhetoric right now, but it's because they're afraid of you. And so continue to fight for the right to educate your kids as you see fit, and you're going to win this war. 12 states have already unleashed education freedom for everybody. It's only a matter of time before all 50 states finally respect parents to direct the upbringing of their own children.
Corey, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you so much for having me.